Right, so this lesson is on plot structure and plot mountains. And the examples I'm going to use here are based on The Lion King. And you may need to watch that again for homework if you need a quick review. Now, plot structure is, how a narrative is put together, how a story is put together. And if you understand plot structure and how it works, it's going to make you a more effective reader and it's going to improve your comprehension for narrative, right? It's not going to help you with nonfiction or history books or science books and things like that. But any novel or short story that you read, if you understand plot, you'll be able to make predictions and your comprehension is just going to be much better. So that's part of why, we're asking you to learn this. All right, so first of all, what is a plot, right? So a plot is a series of actions in a narrative that focuses on the creation of a conflict, the raising of the conflict, the climax of the conflict, and finally the resolution of the conflict. And so you notice that conflict is very important to plot structure. It's really the first thing you want to look at when considering a plot and how it's put together, right? And you have to keep in mind that every story or every narrative has a plot, right? That's kind of a pet peeve of mine. I'll ask someone, well, how was the movie? And they'll say, well, it didn't have a plot. It had a plot. It may not have been a very good plot, but, I guarantee you it had a plot. Right, so like I said, conflict is super important, and we want to start by considering that, right? And we're going to look at both internal and external conflict. So internal conflict, that exists inside of the character, right? It's a mental or emotional challenge, like climbing a mountain, or dealing with guilt, right? In The Lion King, Simba's internal conflict is this guilt and regret that he feels over the things that he did that led to the death of his father. Disobeying Mufasa, going out into the kind of wild areas. He feels guilty about that, and so that's his internal conflict. And then there's external conflict, and that exists outside of the character, right? Like good guy versus bad guy, or a character versus his or her society, or a character versus his or her nature. Nature with a capital N, right? Like blizzards and floods and things like that. I'm talking to you. You're a high school student, right? You're at an interesting point. I've found is, young people latch on to external conflict. It's very simple, good guy versus bad guy, shoot 'em up, things like that. As we grow older, though, as we become more sophisticated and mature readers and viewers of movies and plays and things like that, usually we tend to become more interested in the internal conflict, right? The psychological, the spiritual, the emotional. That's just part of growing up. So, I would urge you to be mindful of that as you encounter narrative, TV shows, movies, whatever. Video games have often very compelling narratives. Are you attracted by the internal or external conflict? Kind of where are you on that development? All right, so let's take a moment to consider protagonists and antagonists. And these are labels for characters, but they're also labels that indicate the role that the character plays within the plot, right? So the main character is the protagonist, right? The most important, the first character is the protagonist. The hero, and this is the person who moves the plot forward, the main character. They're also, almost always the character who experiences the main conflict within the narrative. And then we have the antagonist, right? The person who is against the protagonist, and the villain. They usually start or instigate the conflict. So in The Lion King, Simba's our protagonist, Scar is our antagonist, Mufasa's just a supporting character like the other ones. So let's get into the structure of the plot itself. And I'm going to go sequentially in terms of, this is usually what happens first. This is what happens second. I'll talk about some exceptions too. The exceptions are often what make more challenging literature. Right, so the exposition, the root word there is expose. This is where the setting and the characters are exposed, they're introduced. These are the things that happen before the conflict starts. And so in The Lion King, this is all the stuff that happens before Mufasa dies, right? There is one exception. Some stories, particularly epic literature like the Odyssey, they begin en media res. This is where the narrative starts in the middle of the conflict. The conflict is already going. Right. Sometimes in the exposition there's a backstory. Sometimes in other parts of the plot too there's a backstory. This is any part of the story that happens before the plot began. right? So, for example, in The Lion King, we know that Scar and Mufasa have a long history of fighting, based on some of the conversations they have, particularly the one here when they're in that cave. We can make inferences about the fact that Mufasa and Scar have been bitter, nasty, brotherly rivals for years. I have always wondered too whether Scar is the older brother, maybe just because of his appearance. Um, but stories that begin en media res will often have what we call flashbacks, where the backstory is introduced, and the Odyssey is that way, right? If you've read the Odyssey, most of the Odyssey is Odysseus telling what happened before he got to Calypso's island. So, in fact, most of the Odyssey is a flashback where we get that backstory. Then we have the inciting incident. This is the act or event that starts the conflict. For example, Mufasa dying. And I've already mentioned that. And then the rising action, which is usually the longest part of a plot, the longest in terms of time or pages or however you measure time in a plot. Rising action is usually the longest, right? Because this is the series of acts and events and actions that raise the tension of the conflict and make it exciting, and we know something big is about to happen, right? So in The Lion King, Simba's out in the wilderness with the pig and the weasel. Scar's ruining the Pride Lands, and this is all building up the tension, right? We know that there's some kind of fight coming, and then there's a climax. Right, and the climax is the top, the most tense part of the narrative, where the conflict is tested, and usually we expect the good guy's going to win, but it doesn't always happen that way, and it doesn't have to happen that way. But the climax is where that conflict is tested. And then after the climax, we have the falling action, and this is anything that happens between the climax and the resolution. All the results of the climax are felt. The conflict is winding down. It's slowly resolving itself. Plots don't always have falling action. Or if they do, they vary in length by quite a bit. So I usually tell students not to get too hung up on the falling action. It's there, it exists in some narratives, but it's not kind of a big deal, right? And then you have the resolution, where the conflict is pretty much completely done. Everybody lives happily ever after is the way it happens in a comedy or a happy movie. Everybody's dead in a tragedy, right? Like Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. The whole conflict doesn't have to be resolved, but it has to have come down to a very, very low level, right? And some stories don't have resolutions either. Some stories don't have falling action. They don't have resolution. We call those cliffhangers, right? Where the plot really just ends right at the climax, and they don't even tell you what happened in the climax. TV shows, they always end with like to be continued, or if you're a big Walking Dead fan like I am, it seems like every episode ends on a cliffhanger, and it just some people like cliffhangers. They like that tension and not knowing what happened, and they like to sometimes make up the story for themselves. Cliffhangers drive me nuts. I will throw things at TVs and say bad words at TVs. They drive me nuts because I want to know what happened. And so we can represent a plot with a graph. Simple, up and down here. The y-axis is emotional intensity or tension. X-axis is time. And your standard plot mountain looks something like this. And this is a simplification. That upward sloping line doesn't necessarily need to be a straight line. It can be jagged. But the general trend is such, right? So starts with the exposition. We see the inciting incident is the place where that tension begins. Then we have the rising action, like I said, the longest part of the plot. Climax up at the top. Sometimes it ends on a cliffhanger, sometimes it doesn't. And then the falling action and the resolution. This is a standard kind of classic plot mountain. They don't all look like this. This is a simplification. I use The Lion King because Disney movies, most things written for children usually have a really clean plot like that, whereas something that's more sophisticated like the Odyssey, it doesn't look like this at all. It's much more jagged with the flashbacks and the backstory and stuff like that. So, but this is a good place. If you can master this, then you can, create alternative plots with the flashbacks and stuff easily enough. And so that's it. Thanks for watching.